Tapping.
And we're live.
All right. That wasn't such a bad delay.
No, fine.
All right.
Well, okay. Well, there are two images of you at the bottom of the screen, but I think one of them's from the frozen computer. And if you're joining us now, we are in the Hangout for America's Artistic Legacy. I'm Paul Bass, and I have with me two established scholars today. One being Professor Carol, our leader for this class, and we have a special guest today, Dr. Peter Mooz. Welcome, Professor Carol, and welcome, Dr. Mooz.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. We're so glad that Dr. Peter Mooz can join us. This is something we've looked forward to for weeks, and we hope this will be the first of many opportunities.
Well, talking about art is just my thing, I tell you. It's my life.
Well, I can tell, I can see the passion there for art, and if you have been taking the class, if you've seen the videos, you see that he is featured in the video course, America's Artistic Legacy. Professor Carol, how did that happen? How did you make that happen?
Oh, well, we just got lucky. Actually, we have been blessed to know the Mooz family for a lot of years, and I think we may have met actually over art exhibits in Dallas quite some time ago, but we reunited a number of years ago when we made the program Exploring America's Musical Heritage, and we knew that we needed an expert who was a lot of fun and loved to teach and loved the kids. So we went to Virginia Beach and we begged him to be on camera, and we ran all over the place and went to Williamsburg and did a lot of interviewing, and also seriously interviewed him on subjects in American art, and we were able to use a lot of that material in that program.
Yeah, that was great. Dr. Mooz, how did they wrangle you into that?
Well, it was kind of by surprise. They just asked me to sit down on my couch in my living room and asked me a question, and he started the filming of it, and we just had a very nice time talking about American art and art in general.
Great. Well, I'm so glad to hear from you. Now, you love art, you've studied art. Did you focus on studying American art early in your career?
Well, you never know how things hit you and how your life goes. One of my first memories was going to George Washington's headquarters in White Plains, New York, because I lived in Westchester, and bringing home a horse chestnut from there. And I always had it around, and I always loved history. And then I got into doing art, and we moved to Connecticut and bought a house that was put up in the early 18th century. And so we were living in a museum, literally, when we were up there. And I always took art. I always liked it. But I was headed for law school, and I went to Cornell Law School. And about halfway through, I said to the dean, could I take an art course across the way? And all of a sudden I found out that I was spending 80% of my time on 2 art courses and 20% on law courses. So I came home one night or one vacation and said to my parents that I was going to switch and go into art. And of course it was like somebody died, and they said, oh, you'll never succeed. You'll go up to Vermont and have a pot-bellied stove and wear sandals. And but it was then that my life really began, because I devoted myself full-time to art ever since, and I haven't ever regretted it.
And in your studies, you focus on American art, is that correct?
Yes. Well, when I was at Cornell, I started taking a couple of courses on American art, and one of them was on the Armory show, because it was in 1964 on the 50th anniversary of it, and a part of the show went to Utica, which was not far from Cornell, so the teacher based it on that. So really, this is like coming home to me. But to answer your question, most particularly, I had such a hard time passing the French exam and the German exam for my PhD that American was the only thing that was really I could do scholarship in.
Wow. Well, I know that you were in, as we mentioned, you were in the video Exploring American Music Heritage, Musical Heritage, and I just want to throw a plug in there real quick for those viewers to go on the website, make that purchase. It's a DVD set. It's great. It's not only with Dr. Mooz. There are artists and experts from all around the country in that video series. But you talked about the complexity of defining American art, and especially in early American art. Is that correct?
Yes, that's a very important distinction that needs to be made between what might be called amateur English art done in England by Englishmen and American art, which appears to be similar to that, but is different because A, the materials were different. You didn't have linen canvas here, and Robert Feek, for example, used bed ticking to paint on. And so the materials that they had to work on were different and causes things to be different. Their life experiences, walking through thickets of woodlands, you didn't have that experience in England so much. The experiences are different, the vision is different, the light is different, so that there is a distinction to be made between a colonial art and just art, derivative art in a country, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we talk about Russian art, French art, Italian art, American art, and in all of those cases we have an image of what that Italian art means in terms of its darker colors or this or that, or the French who love details and like Rococo little circles all over everywhere, and Russian art, which tends to be very rugged and realistic. So we just have to think about those different countries, and we know when somebody holds up something that, my goodness, that's done by a German artist, because we have a notion of what German art is like.
Hmm. Is art, quote, American if it's created here, even if the artist is British or, say, French? Or is art American if the artist is American but lives overseas?
Well, you have a lot of that kind of interchange. Back to the colonial period, you have lots of Englishmen who came over here and painted pictures, made a lot of money, and went home. Then you have people like John Copley, who on the eve of the Revolution had painted most of the English supporters and had to get out of town. So he went from Boston to England. And surprisingly, after the first president of the English Royal Academy, Copley and Benjamin West, both Americans, were the two candidates to become president of the British Academy. So you do have this kind of mix. And at the time of the Ashcan School and the early 19th century, there's hardly an artist who doesn't go to Paris at one time or another. But they learn what they learn in Paris, and then they come back here and create American art. And this can be defined for a long, if you take a very careful, long look at what it's all about. But there is cross-fertilization, and interestingly enough, I once did a show when I was director of the Virginia Museum on the art of the South, and we had to define this. Was the art of the South only art done by Southerners in the South, or was it a Winslow Homer who came down and did paintings of the Civil War, and he was from Maine? So we had to kind of define it, and if you take certain characteristics and list them, you get 4 or 5, 6, maybe more certain characteristics which are associated with, in this case, Southern art. And then when you see those characteristics in the picture, even though it might be done by somebody from Germany who came over to stay here, he is doing Southern art or American art.
Okay. Well, is it fair to say that American artists sort of pulled even with European artists in, say, the mid or late 19th century?
Well, it's I would say perhaps 3 stages. The first stage is by Cole, who was the first greatest and all-time American Hudson River landscape painter, and he wrote a book in 1834 on painting the American landscape, and he was the first one that kind of defined the fact that there was an American style and American painters. Curiously, it was a year later that Ralph Waldo Emerson gave his famous speech at Harvard called The American Scholar, where he defined the fact that at that point he felt Americans were creating their own scholarship. Then there comes a time at around the 1900 when the American artists really wanted to assert themselves and say that there really was a difference between European-influenced American art and real American art, and they began to paint what we basically call American realism, but they go to America for their subject matter and their approach and all of that sort of thing. Then the final thing is about at the time of the Second World War. A lot of the Germans, Albers and Hartung, and a lot of them came over from Germany, from France. Mondrian came to Broadway in New York and did a famous picture called Broadway. The war forced a number of Europeans to come here. They stayed and participated in what was the first major universal language or style, the abstract expressionist school, sometimes called the New York School. And at that point, the center of art moves from France to New York City. So I would say those 3 elements are the key elements.
Very good.
That's so great. I'm just enjoying this so much. I love being Peter Mooz's student, and I've had opportunities, but never enough. Well, Peter, when we talk about that late 19th or mid to late 19th century and the group that we focused on in some of our recent class sessions, the Ashcan School, and I know you're going to juxtapose that with the group clustered around the new proponents of this art called photography, but the Ashcan School, that sounds, when you first hear it, it sounds so wacky. You know, it sounds like something somebody came up with in the 60s or something, and yet this was a serious group of American artists. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, the Ashcan comes from a specific sentence that one of the critics of the show of the 8, which was held in 1908 at the Macbeth Gallery, that Sloan and a couple of others did pictures of alleyways and people hanging up laundry, and kind of the back of their apartments. And of course, that's where you kept the ash cans, because of course everybody had coal furnaces then, and they kept the ash cans and the garbage cans and all of that outside their back door. So this guy, as a kind of a term of derision, called it the Ashcan School. The Ashcanners were appalled, of course, at first, because they were painting the people, these people who were hanging up the laundry and taking out the garbage and doing all of that sort of stuff. But it stuck, and after a while, they talked about themselves as the Ashcan School a little bit. It really was realism, and perhaps even social realism that the Ashcan term is meant to describe.
Okay, so, and yet, I mean, these artists, and when we see these paintings now, I mean, they still absolutely speak to us about the American urban experience. And isn't it true that I'm sure they could have gone out and sometimes did do beautiful landscapes, but they were very focused on showing the growing urban world during the Gilded Age as we became more industrial and built up this complex thing we call the modern city. And that's where they found their artistic truth. Was that fair to say?
Yes, there was a lot more going on. Part of it was you could call it a political or economic struggle. These were new artists who were coming in, who were competing against the old entrenched traditional artists like Sargent and Whistler and Gary Melchers and people like that, who were working in a very European influence style and sold and made lots of money. Some of them are millionaires. Sargent was, for example, and got huge commissions. And they wanted to get in on, and they wanted to sell their stuff. So instead of doing high-class portraiture and fancy subjects, I have one here. This is the style of Whistler, and he's doing Venice, and he's showing you some people at having coffee, and it's all very pretty, very influenced by Impressionism and that sort of thing. Well, the Ashcan people took on stark realism. No wonderful flourishes and impressionist light. They wanted real light, and the light of that existed. And in some cases, for example, you see them doing, like, the cliff dwellers is a famous thing, and the cliffs were the brick tenements that they lived in. And it shows the light coming in very strongly at one point, and the rest of it kind of in semi-darkness. Well, this was to show the fact that these were people living in some pretty tough conditions and only got light in their window for about 2 hours a day when it was passing over another house that was a little bit lower or something like that. And they wanted piercing light. They also had a kind of new religion, if you will, where all these more established painters were painting for a crowd of people who were established and went to fine churches and went to all sorts of wonderful events. But they wanted to talk about all these new people from Poland and Ireland and the Jewish populations and all these new populations that were coming to New York, because they were new and different and fascinating, because they brought all of these new customs with them, and had one of the famous people who did it was Luke's, for example, did the Columbus Day parade under the archway on Washington Square, and they all wore the costumes that they had worn back in Europe, and they hooted and hollered and played the music of their homelands, and he was totally brought up in this kind of thing and did many pictures of it. But one of the things you have to remember was they are all carrying American flags. So even though they're Polish and Irish and all of this, they were committed Americans and very proud of it. And so it was a kind of a social statement for these people, and in direct opposition to established art. See what I mean?
Did they find a market? How long did it take before they really found a market? Because, I mean, you always think of the starving artist, and of course they did work and need each other, I think, in some respects. But how long before it caught on?
Well, this was a very important sort of thing about the Armory Show. One thing we have to realize about the Armory Show, that many books say, oh, the Armory Show in 1913 came along and changed American art forever, and it was the major thing, event that happened. And you can point to it in that way, but there were a number of things that happened before that were just as important to answer your question as the Armory Show, because Alfred Stieglitz, who was born in Hoboken, New Jersey, but went as a teenager to Germany and got interested in photography, came back home, and in 1902 established the 291 Gallery at 291 Fifth Avenue as the Photo Secessionist Gallery. And secessionist, as you know, means that they are seceding from the normal, traditional kind of photography that you saw. And he showed all sorts of wild stuff, mechanical things, people doing interesting, unusual stuff, and he was trying to bring some of the cultural perspectives of Germany and the photography that was going on there to New York. But it fell rather flat, although it did establish, and these people did establish, Greenwich Village as the place where the artists lived, worked, and showed their work. And Greenwich Village got its reputation for being a kind of an avant-garde place from Stieglitz and his group as early as 1902. But and of course in 1905 he set it up as a regular gallery, and it operated from 1905 to 1917, and then became the American Place, and it existed right up till 1951 when he died. But one of his friends was Robert Henry, who'd spent 10 years in France painting under the best French painters, but he came back, started to teach at the 10th Street Studio, which was William Merritt Chase's place where he was, and a number of other artists. And they had been at 10th Street, had gone on for many decades, and was where Homer and all sorts of people before 1900 went to learn how to paint. But they were down on 10th Street, and my golly, all these Ashcan people, they were up on 23rd Street, way uptown, which then was way uptown. Now uptown or midtown is 54th Street, but New York was a lake and a few other things in 1902. It was only until Vanderbilt built his house on what is now the Plaza in New York, where the Plaza Hotel is, that anybody even dreamt of moving up there. But there was a culture that was developed at that particular time, and they opened what was called the Macbeth Gallery, a very wonderful man, Macbeth, in 1907. And a year later, Henry got together a bunch of his friends, he had been, before he went to France, a person who made pictures for newspapers. You didn't have photographs, you had drawn pictures or lithographs or what have you. And he got 3 or 4 of his friends from Philadelphia and created what was known as the 8. He got Sloan, Lukes, Shin, then Glackens. Now Lawson and Davies and Prendergast were sort of hangers-on a little bit, but it was really started by these 5 graphic artists who had to work for newspapers to pay the bills, and they were invited up to New York by Henry to do this particular show. Now, I only will say that it created an absolute hysteria, and when it opened in 1908, they had to call the police to take care of everybody, and it was on the 3rd floor of a building on West 35th Street, which was really way up, and it had 260 paintings, and that was the cause célèbre for what happened at the Armory show. These people, the 8, wanted to sell their pictures, and they realized that most of America just didn't get it. They didn't see what was in it, and they wanted to figure out how they would get into it and get people to buy their pictures. And that's when they hatched up the plot of the Armory show.
So great, you know, when you can look back at history and it all seems so clear, and this narrative that we like to follow when we retell history, when we luxuriate in history, and yet you have to realize there's a bunch of desperate guys going, we've got this great stuff and nobody knows about it. What are we going to do? Well, let's try this. Well, that's a crazy idea. Well, let's give it a shot. You know, I mean, you just have to remember these are young and not sometimes not so young, but artists that are just committed, and they have nothing to stop them, but nothing much to encourage them either. And off they go and launch something that now has its own chapter in the art history books, and yet it certainly didn't seem that way going into it, probably.
Sure. Well, they had been used to doing commercial art and got paid for by the newspapers to make pictures of the Tweed mob or whoever they were showing, but they had training, a lot of them at the Pennsylvania Academy, and most of them in Paris, and they really wanted to be full-time expressive painters and be able to make a living at it. So that's when they hatched up the idea of the Armory show. And it started actually in 1911 when the 8 began a new group called the Association of American Painters and Sculptors. This was in contrast to the National Academy of Design, which was all the old-timers and the stuffy portrait painters and all of that sort of thing. And they tried to figure out what they were going to do, and the idea came to them that they really had to bring over the kind of pictures that they were used to seeing when they were in Paris and in France. And they had seen Van Gogh, and they had seen Cézanne, and they had seen all the great new ones coming along. But in Europe, there was a regular sort of sequence of things happening, so people understood a lot of the contemporary art, Matisse, for example. But in America, they had hardly ever seen things by Picasso and so forth. So they said, aha, we will bring these people from Europe, and everybody will see it, and then they will know that we're doing something new here and see where it all comes from. So they invited, they got a group together, Walt Kuhn, and finally A.B. Davies became the president of the group. They sent a committee of about 3 people over to Europe and got people to send over the Matisses and so forth. And at this particular point, then they decided they got about 600 paintings from Europe. Then they put in, of their own paintings, 1,300 paintings. And it had to be held at the Armory, which was the huge place where they practiced marching and saluting and everything. And they had to have someplace that large to accommodate some 2,500 paintings. So it was really to lure people in to see their work as well as to see where it had come from. And of course, most writers make the mistake of saying, oh, the whole thing was a big come on. But in truth, the PR really focused on the Europeans, the Duchamps, so forth and so on, and that's what got the play in the papers. I mean, it's man bites dog kind of journalism that they were doing, and so they focused on all of these crazy Europeans, and so people think of it as a mostly European show, but it was 2/3 American painting, so that they could hopefully get their paintings sold.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh, we just lost his volume.
Yeah.
Peter.
That's kind of sudden.
Wonder why.
Yeah.
We certainly don't want to lose a word of what he's saying either.
I know.
Let me see if we can get a little help here.
Things have
I think
happened.
he may have gotten
There you are.
enthusiastic.
Okay.
Peter? Peter, are you back?
Yes.
Yeah, you went away, and
I'm
we didn't
here.
want you to go away. So you just finished. Let's
Okay.
pick up where you were.
My chair is rolling. My chair is rolling.
Don't roll.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
I'll just
So
tell
let's
you
go
a
back to
little
where
bit
you were.
about why it had such a pervasive influence. Two things happened. One thing was that a lot of people right afterwards began to open up galleries in New York. The Bourgeois Gallery opened up. The Danielle Gallery, which became very important, was founded by a bartender who decided that he liked the Ashcan things because they did real people. And this was really Montrose Gallery that operated right up until not very long ago. This was the foundation of New York as a center for going to galleries and selling pictures. And so it wasn't necessarily the Armory show and the hoo-ha that went on about that. It was the fact that people got the idea that they should have galleries and show some of the pictures by the people who had participated. The other thing was Kuhn and Davies and so forth became known for what they did to get the show going, and they were hired by people like Rockefeller and the wealthy, the Vanderbilts, and lots of wealthy people to help them buy European pictures. So the people that organized the show then became kind of consultants to all of the rich people who wanted to buy a lot of paintings, and literally are the foundations of the collections at the Art Institute in Chicago, for example, with the Palmer family, you know, the Palmer Hotel and everything that they owned. They bought more pictures from Impressionists than were sold in France. That's how the Grand Jacques got out there. Same thing happened with the American things. And also these people became advisors to new museums which were sprouting. The Metropolitan had been founded in 1870, and by 1900, okay, it was 30 years old and it was in a little square building downtown. Well, it wasn't until 1870 that they decided that they would really make something of it, and they needed Davies and others to come and tell them what to buy. And as a matter of fact, the Metropolitan bought one of the Matisses right out of the Armory show. That was one of the first pictures that had been acquired by a major museum of a really, I mean, think of Matisse when he first started painting. I mean, now things have gone way beyond that. But in those days, for the Metropolitan Museum of Art to buy a Gauguin was just incredible. So those are the things: galleries and buying contemporary European art. That's what the effect of the Armory show was, and it was a lasting one, because with the museums growing and the New York as the center of art, it was ready for, in the 40s and 50s, to become the center of world art.
All right, I want to throw something from left field. Can I, Professor Carol?
Oh, you better believe it. That's so wonderful.
Yeah, I know. It just has me just, my mind is just going everywhere as you're mentioning these things. My uncle, you're just tying me into my heritage. My uncle was a commercial artist in New York City, so, my mind is just cranking, and it's really, it's an endearing subject for me. But this is totally a layman question here, but I think of the New Yorker magazine when you're saying all this, and when did the New Yorker, we may have to back up a little bit, I don't know, when did it become this, when I think of the New Yorker, I think of a display of just art in there. Obviously it's other things as well, but I think of American art.
And cartoons.
Yes.
I'm not sure of the date the New Yorker started, but I know it was very important in the 20s, so it had to have started somewhat before that. But one of the most important publications at that time was one called The Masses, which started up about 1910 or so. But in the middle of the First World War in 1917, it was labeled socialist, and of course anything socialist in 1917 wouldn't sell. But the Masses magazine was one that really trumpeted modern styling. But people like these artists, Sloan and Lukes and all, there was a second wave of these people who worked on papers and magazines. The one I put out for your interest is
now we've given you a brain freeze.
And we all, Norman Rockwell.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, yay.
I mean, he started out in the early 20s just doing sketches, and then he did covers, and then now in our era, he's shown as an authentic regular painter, and we have shows in Los Angeles and other places. But he stayed pretty much with the commercial art scene. But others of his friends, and I have some of them back here, like Bellows, took his illustration background and became a full-time professional painter and stopped doing commercial things entirely. Before I go, I want to show you, this is a picture by Everett Shinn called Snowbound, and he was one of the 8 that showed at Macbeth in 1908, but he wasn't like Sloan so much because he was highly influenced by Impressionism, and you can see that in his choice of subject and how he's doing it. But because if you look in back of me, down in the lower portion, there's a sort of a bluish picture. It's covering up one of my favorites, Marilyn Monroe. But you can see that this is a picture of three girls, secretaries, getting home. They've taken the L and they've walked down the stairs and they're going home to their house in Brooklyn somewhere. He's more of what we think of than Shin. And the eight did different things. Arthur B. Davies did pictures about unicorns and Greek mythology and things like that. But all of that was very new because his work was almost like Puvis de Chavannes, who was really successful in Paris and was doing wonderful big works of art. He brought that style over here, and he was a big flop for a while until people sort of caught on to it. But I was talking about bellows. Here's one of a typical bellows out in the farmland with the farm horses and the fields and all of that. He started out just as a plain magazine illustrator, but had such talent. He was fantastically talented, and became able to support himself quite well as a regular artist over the time. But magazines and before them the newspapers have a very definite role. So you put your finger on something that was very key in the development of American art. And American art has a kind of commercial overtone. A lot of it does, because we don't have kings and popes who are sponsors of art and commission art. There's no commissions in America. You've got to paint something that somebody's going to want, and you don't know who it is. So there is a sort of commercial overtone to almost all of American art.
Good point.
Peter and Paul, we've had the pleasure many times of being at Dr. Mooz's home, which, as you can already see, is filled with real art. It's like walking, through the rabbit hole, and no matter what the topic or the era, you can be talking about the Renaissance or what, he just happens to have some paintings,
Wow.
the real ones, and acquiring art, Peter, I mean, that is your passion. Do you feel like when you look at these paintings, the Sloane behind you or whatever you've got, are they like members of your household? I mean, can you tell us a little bit about how you might have come into inviting certain ones of them, or even one of them, to become part of your life?
Well, at first, my first job was with Winterthur, which is the home of the greatest collection of American furniture and paintings of the colonial era and so forth. And so I could not collect American things because it would have been in competition with my job. So I started collecting English and some European things, French modern, Picasso and Matisse and Miro and a lot of other people who worked in France in the 20s and the 30s, because I like that stuff. And the first picture I ever bought was a Picasso right on the bridge that you go over to the Louvre, to go into the Louvre. When I was 25, I guess, they had a Picasso for sale there. But then I went into museums that collected everything, universal, from Egypt to Jackson Pollock. So I really didn't collect for quite a long time. And then in 1996, I finished up in Texas, and we came here, and I kind of retired. Well, I really didn't. I started a real estate business, but that paid the bills, and that gave me money to buy art. So that's when I started collecting all kinds of things, and we'll do some future things on some of the other collections perhaps the European collection or the classical collection or whatever. And actually, it was not until 2 years ago that I started collecting in earnest American things, and I decided that I would only collect prints, etchings, lithographs, that sort of thing. And over this shoulder, you can probably see a picture of a minister, and that was done in 1743. And so my collection goes all the way around the room, and this room is 24 feet long, with pictures all through the 3 centuries of American art, and it ends with my Marilyn Monroe, done by Andy Warhol, who happened to have been a very good friend of mine during my museum years, and he signed it for me. So it has lots of different things. One we could talk about is Thomas Hart Benton, known as a regionalist. And you see, out of the Armory show, when the sales got going, several different ideas about painting came in. Some of them were precisionist, some of them were cubist, and one of the main one was these scenes by Grant Wood and Benton and Curry that were known as regionalists, they were called, because they painted, this is a scene of Kansas with the windmill and the hogs and all of that. Now, this was a very odd thing in collecting. I was going through the computer, and I saw this picture that was for sale by an English store, print collector store, and it was said by Thomas Hart Bellows, and then it said $10, and I couldn't believe it. Well, nobody in England had heard of Thomas Hart Benton, and I don't think that they wanted to look at Kansas in 1922 very much, so they were selling it for $10. Well, when it arrived, not only was it signed in the plate, but it was also signed in pencil by Thomas Hart Benton himself. And a signed piece by an artist like him, even though it's just a print, is worth between $1,500 and $4,500, depending on how rare it is. So this English print company didn't know anything about what they had. And that's the clue to collecting, is that it isn't so much what's out there to buy, it's what's in your head to know what it is. And if you know what these things are, even if you specialize in salt cellars, I don't care. If you know as much about salt cellars as anybody in the world, you are going to be able to make some pretty good deals. And so knowing about American art and who Benton was and what have you, I bought it, and not that I'm going to resell it to anybody, but it's increased my net worth, I suppose. But that's what happens.
Professor Carol, this is I'm just cracking up here because you brought on our show just someone who's amazing. Like you said, we're going to have to do this again. And I even see a hangout, just taking the camera and panning around and looking at all the different art in your house there. That's amazing. Most people have a poster, a Warhol poster that they, bought at the poster store, or the music store, and but you have a Warhol on your wall, correct?
The Pink Marilyn.
That's crazy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And you see, I met him when he had his second show, because I was a graduate student at Penn helping the University of Pennsylvania Institute of Contemporary Art, and Warhol came down and we had a show, and so I was about 25 and he was about 23, and we met and we were friends until he unfortunately died at 58. So and I have a Andy Warhol. I call my museum career the time of the two Andys, Andy Warhol and Andy Wyeth. Now, can you think of any more polar opposites? But I went to see Andy Wyeth one time at his studio to ask him about a show or whatever, and I noticed a piece of art. Oh, I didn't take it down. Noticed a piece of paper on the floor, and it had a picture of a house, a stone house, and a big blot of ink on it. And I said, "Oh, Andy, what's that?" And he said, "Oh, I had to stop doing that one because I got a big blotch of ink on it." And I said, "Well, Andy, would you sign it and give it to me?" And he did. And so that's hanging on the wall over there. So at least I have something real by each one of my friends.
Oh, by the two Andys. Oh, man.
Paul, I'm seeing a filming
where
trip.
do we go from here?
I'm seeing a filming trip. I'm seeing a special documentary as we spend an afternoon with Dr. Peter Mooz and his wife Betty Mooz, who shares his love of art. And I'm seeing this, Paul. Aren't you kind of?
Oh, yes. You get me brainstorming here. You're getting my wheels turning.
Well, we have just begun to.
That is music to a teacher's ears to hear that it's getting other people sort of to open their eyes, because there's so much out in this world that unless we train our eyes a little bit on art, we miss half of what the world has to offer. All the beauty of the world, yes, we see in a sunset or something like that, but the other things of beauty, the architecture, whatever, we miss that. The painting on the side of a boat of the 19th century, or any of these things, it adds a dimension to our life that heaven blessed us with, and we need to learn how to see it.
Well put. Heaven blessed us with it. Wow, that's great. Well, I think this is a great place to bring it to a close. As much as we want to keep going on, I mean, literally, I have questions that are just way too self-serving to even do on a webcast like this. But definitely, we will talk hopefully in the future. Professor Carol, thank you for bringing Dr. Mooz into the discussion today. For those of you watching, just make sure that you share this. This video will be up on YouTube. It'll go directly to YouTube, and make sure you post it and share it with your friends. Also, go to the website professorcarol.com and join the Circle of Scholars. This information, the course America's Artistic Legacy, and the products are there as well, which is the Exploring American Music Heritage, which features Dr. Mooz in it. Thank you, Dr. Mooz, and thank you, Professor Carol, for joining us in this hangout today.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.